with the admin side of it. First of all, say, unfortunately, Jane Harrison isn't with us today. A member of her family isn't well, and she's looking after them. So we got a sort of amended program. We've got a maximum of an hour, but I suspect we won't be that long. I'm chairing, and as I said, Naomi Hogan, our administrator, is doing exactly that and administrating behind the scenes. And Libby Bateman, who is the third advisor in the North team, who's waving at you now, is also speaking. So I'll be starting, and my main topic is water, which is, in its broadest sense, we're covering quite a lot of water issues that are increasingly important. And I'll then hand over to Libby on rural crime, and in particular hare coursing, which is a significant problem, which he will go into in some detail. I've then got a potpourri of issues I want to talk about, and then Libby then may come in with any other ones she wants, issues she wants to flag up that you should be paying attention to at the moment as farmers and landowners. And lastly, questions, and I would encourage you please to ask questions. Part of the point of these sessions is because in this wretched pandemic, we're not seeing physically as much of our members as we would wish. We're trying to engage with you to remind you we're still here to provide the free advice from us. And it is really important to us that we make a success of these and we reach out to you. So the North team, the North advisory team, as you know, is myself, Jane and Libby. I'm a chartered surveyor by training. Hopefully a fair few will know me. I was in private practice in Yorkshire for over 20 years. And mostly acting for landlords, but I had quite a few farmer clients as well. So I've come across most problems that landowners face. And the three of us are your starting point for any issues you may have. And do please come to us first by preference before going to the London team, even if we need subsequently to involve them on issues such as tax or legal matters, because it's nice for us to know what your problems are, and also we can keep an eye on the problem and make sure that it hasn't slipped below the radar and the London team. The tax team, for instance, is extremely busy. An awful lot of our members seem to be using the pandemic and the lockdown to address their tax issues, and they are very snowed under. So that's how we work. On today, please keep yourselves muted throughout unless you're actually speaking. Use the raise hand function or the chat box to ask a question. Naomi will be keeping an eye on that for me, and we will go from there. So great to see you all, and I hope it turns out to be useful. Now, water. I've got responsibility for water in all its forms in the North team, and it is an increasing issue. And I think it's something that increasingly farmers and landowners should really think about. And I suppose it goes to global warming, where we seem to be getting drier summers and wetter winters. And we seem to be getting more frequent extreme weather events and more extreme weather events. So planning for all of those is not just a good thing. I think it's really, really essential. If you're an arable part of the country, the water is increasingly, I think, over the next few years, going to become a commodity of itself. So if you grow arable crops, you may need to think about storing water in the winter so that you can use it in the summer. And wetter winters, there's going to be a growing need for more flood management. Now, I do think that ELMS, the Environmental Land Management Scheme that's coming in to replace the Basic Payment Scheme, is highly likely, and this is me crystal ball gazing because we don't know what format it's going to take yet, but I strongly suspect that there will be a big element of water management within ELMS, and that there will be options where farmers can enter into with things like water storage on their land and get paid for it. That is really important. One of the big frustrations that we have as an organization, and a lot of our members have, is water getting stored on their land, actually quite deliberately by the Environment Agency at the moment, but without any appropriate level of compensation. It's something that we are raising continually at the higher levels of the Environment Agency on a regular basis, and we will go on doing that. In the end, I think the solution will probably be elms, but in the meantime, that's no consolation to an arable farmer that I know of in East Yorkshire who, for probably the third time in 5 years, has had to completely reseed, replant arable crops because there's been water stored in his land for so long that the original crop has failed. Water management. What I think is going to happen is that there is already to an extent, but there will increasingly be an approach to water based on the entire catchment from the very top of the highest hill right the way down to the estuary. And what that will involve or should involve up on the moorland is trying to increase the volume of the sponge, which can be done. People think, well, once the sponge is full, it's full. Well, that's true, but in the 60s and the early 70s, across wide swathes of our moorland, there were grants paid for what's called gripping, which are, for those of you who don't know, they're open drains cut into the peat. And this was an attempt to increase the agricultural productivity of the moorland, because there were a lot of mines then that went back to the war and went back to food rationing. And productivity of our sheep farmers was considered to be really important. Aside from the unfortunate effect of overgrazing on moorland and the loss of a lot of heather, the other effect was that these grips decreased the volume of the sponge. Now, a lot of the grips have been blocked on heather moorland, but very few on grass moorland, which is 80% of our moorland. So there is a lot that could be done to increase the volume of the sponge simply by blocking those grips, and touch wood, that will be an element for which moorland for hill farmers will get paid under elms. On the middle ground, that's where the natural flood management, NFM, and the slow the flow, which is the other buzz phrase, will come into play, where again I hope people get paid to put in leaky dams in woodland or water storage areas, perhaps some tree planting, and these other measures. Remeandering, which is great, but it's technically only really feasible where you've got the same riparian owner on both banks, otherwise it becomes enormously complex. But all those other natural flood management measures, which are being trialled at the moment in various places, including at Pickering, but unlikely to become widespread. Down on the flatlands, once the water's down onto the floodplain, then you really need to get it out to sea quite quickly. And the dredging work that should have been done over the past 30 years simply hasn't. I'm thinking, for instance, of the River Hull, but that needs to be sorted out. On the work to do that on the flat land at the bottom around the estuaries, I can see an increased role for drainage boards. I have been working really since I joined the CLA 6 years ago to re-establish the drainage boards that used to exist in the Northwest. They were all abolished. I really don't know why, but they were all abolished really in the mid-70s and have ceased to exist. And over on the York Crosslands in Lancashire, you got the largest area of Grade 1 land, 35,000 acres of Grade 1 land that doesn't have a drainage board in the UK. We discovered that there was a cock-up in the drafting of the Land Drainage Act 1991, which is the statutory side of drainage boards, which meant you can't establish new ones. I won't bore you with the detail. But we've persuaded DEFRA to put a clause into the Environment Bill that is currently in front of Parliament, and we hope will become law this autumn, that will correct that. And that will allow both the creation of new drainage boards and the enlargement of existing ones. And with farmer and landowner support, I can see an increased role for drainage boards, really on the basis that they do that essential work, especially on the lower ground, down towards the estuaries, much more efficiently and much more cost effectively than the Environment Agency. So that is ongoing work, and I would urge you to think about water in the longer term and its place on your farm, on your estate, and how best to manage it in the light of increase volumes of it, as I say, in the winter, and decrease volumes of it in the summer. And I'll stop there for the minute. I hope that's prompted some questions and some thoughts. And I'll hand over now to Libby for her to crack on and tell you about hare coursing and other rural crime. Libby.
Hi all, thanks for joining us this afternoon. Oh, I've gone on to speaker view. Just to say, I've just put my email address and Robert's and also my colleague Jane's in the chat bar. So if you do have any questions you want to ask us outside the meeting, just do get in touch with us. So I'm going to talk a little bit about hare coursing and then probably go on to rural crime in general. And then I'm going to cover a little bit about access, which Jane was going to pick up today as well. So I'll start with hare coursing. I think most of you will know, but for those of you that don't, this is it's a kind of poaching activity, but it's really high stakes illegal gambling. And it's undertaken by rather unsavory characters who access people's lands by breaking gates, and they trash crops because they video this activity from their vehicles. So they drive across the field, and that's then live streamed to people who are placing bets on the dogs. It is pretty vile. It was outlawed by the Hunting Act in 2004. So that the dogs, it's against the law to hunt a mammal with a dog. However, there are lots of problems with bringing convictions under the act due to the burden of proof, realistically. So we're finding that our members are really struggling with this. They're visited 2 or 3 times a week through the season. That starts end of August once the crops are cleared from the field, and closes normally around the end of March when the crops start to get up again. So we're coming to the tail end of it at the moment, but as I say, people who are blighted by it, they have regular visits, and it isn't about poaching, it isn't taking one for the pot, it's about high stakes illegal betting, although it is generally dealt with under poaching legislation just because there isn't really anything else there to deal with it. So I'm just going to talk to a little bit about what we're doing to try and make that work better for our members. Firstly, in September, we relaunched our hare coursing action plan, which has got a list of things we want to see happen to make things better. One of those actions was for 101 call handlers, well, any call handler actually, because it's the same people that answer the phone on 101 as it is on 999. And we want them to understand what hare coursing is, so that when one of our members picks up the phone and says help, they know exactly what they're dealing with. We've written to all the police and crime commissioners on that. They've all responded quite positively, and have promised to look in. Some of them have given us an opportunity to actually feed into the training for the call handlers, which has been really good. However, we've not won that war entirely because the call handlers are a really high turnover of people for 2 reasons. One is it's quite a difficult job, I understand, and some people just decide it's not for them, and then others use it as a platform to get into the main police force. So there is a high turnover, so we're going to have to keep pushing that one forward, to keep rolling it on. We want to see a change in legislation. As I said before, it's very hard to bring a conviction under the Hunting Act because of the burden of proof. So most of these convictions are brought under the Game Act, Section 30 of the Game Act, as a poaching offence, and that has a much lower penalty. So we're finding that these people are getting sort of 200 quid fines. Another problem with the legislation is the police do have the powers to seize dogs from hare coursers in the field at the time. However, they don't do it, and they don't do it because of the budgetary pressures on housing the dogs for the 4 months it might take for the case to get to court. And at the moment, there's no legal mechanism for them to be able to reclaim the cost of kenneling that dog from the offender at conviction. And then in parallel to that, the courts are very reluctant to give a forfeiture order of the dogs if it's not already in custody, because how would you find it? How would you know which dog it was? I need to probably add that these dogs are worth an absolute fortune to these people. They change hands for a lot of money because of their ability to win on the gambling. So that's the 2 legislative changes. We're working in tandem on this with the Countryside Alliance and with the National Farmers Union. We've got a coalition together. We've written to ministers. We've had sessions with DEFRA. They're a little bit reticent because they've got a manifesto pledge not to touch the hunting Act, and we've said, well, we're not asking you to touch the Hunting Act. So and then just Wednesday, was that just yesterday? It was, gosh, yesterday morning we had a meeting with Lord Goldsmith on this issue as well, because obviously he's in number 10 and he leads on wildlife. So instead of just bothering DEFRA, because it just goes across so many departments, everybody keeps saying, go and talk to somebody else. So we're hoping to have taken that forward. It was Matt Bridgman and myself who was talking to Lord Goldsmith yesterday morning. So we're hoping that'll move forwards. We also want it to be a notifiable offence. So at the moment, it isn't notifiable. So some guy gets done in Cambridge for hare coursing, and then he gets done in Lancashire for hare coursing. It's treated as a first offence. Equally, we have problems with data, because section 30 of the Game Act, it doesn't hold species data. So it doesn't say it's hare, it just says it's poaching, if that makes sense. So if this became notifiable, we would know a lot more about these offences. We, CLA, have been collecting a little list of offences just on Google searches. We've got about 167 offences on there at the moment. About 75% of those have been convicted under the Game Act, not the Hunting Act, which is why the Game Act is where we're sort of put our sights. We also want some better resources in the National Wildlife Crime Unit, because that it has the power to do it, but hasn't really had the energy up until recently. Anybody on the call from Yorkshire may know somebody called Kev Kelly, who was part of their rural task force right from its inception, and he's just taken over the boss of the National Rural Crime Network. So we're feeling really positive about that. So that's just a little bit about the problem and what we're doing to try and solve it. There is going to be something in the magazine in April, so keep your eyes down on that. And then looking sort of wider rural crime, because hare coursing, these people are generally quite unsavoury and might be casing the joint and come back and nick your quad bike afterwards. So we're working with the police officers and also, other people who might perhaps work in the security industry to sort of put together some ideas about how our members might better protect themselves. It's a term called target hardening, which the police, anybody familiar with police, they use it quite regularly. So it's looking about coming into your farmyard and looking at how you might improve your own security. So we're hopefully going to be putting together a webinar on that to date of the 22nd of April. So keep your eyes down about how people can better protect themselves, but at the same time as making sure that the police are helping when they're asked. They come when they're asked. So that's the sort of general rural crime stuff. I want to just go on a little bit now onto the countryside code. A lot of you may have heard about the roadmap for reopening after we come out of COVID. And there's potentially quite a bit of pressure between the 29th of March and the 12th of April, because people are going to be able to move around from the 29th of March, but none of the accommodation, none of the campsites, none of the cafes, restaurants, anything like that will be open until the 12th of April. And of course, in the middle of there, we've got Easter. I think it's the first time I've ever heard a large outdoor tourist attraction hoping that it was going to be raining at Easter. So we've potentially got a huge amount of pressure, and it's the farmers and landowners that are going to end up dealing with this, as people might come and go to the off license and pick up a tent on the way past and set up camp somewhere and generally leave beer cans, be rather unsavoury. So we're trying to we already have been since the last lockdown. We've been working with LEAF, which is a linking environment and farming, to put together an education package on the countryside code. So we will be going into schools once the schools are fully back, and delivering this education programme in the hope that those people soon become adults, and also that kind of rubs off on their parents. So we're going to be doing a lot of sort of social media on this. There is a risk, of course, of preaching to the converted with it. So we're going to have to make sure that gets out of our social media, and other people regurgitate that. So if you see something on this countryside code, if you have social media channels, do regurgitate it, because then it gets viral. That's what we need it to do. We need it to go far and wide. So, and it's not just a case of get off my land. It's not a case of don't do this and don't do that. The message is, we want people to enjoy the countryside. We want them to be able to enjoy it, but we do want them to understand why they have to enjoy it sensibly. Additional pressures this as we come out of lockdown is it's lambing time in the uplands, and also there's a lot of ground nesting birds. So trying to encourage people, if you just shout at someone, tell them to put their dog on the lead, it doesn't work. But trying to, encourage them right from the start to say, look, there's ground nesting birds, I've got very vulnerable lambs. So through signage and stuff like that. So encouraging members to make sure they've got their signage, their way markers. And if there is a bit of land that's private, don't be afraid to put a sign up, say this bit's actually private, you shouldn't go through this way. But if you get the chance, an opportunity to explain why it's important people behave in a certain way in the countryside, then do take it, whether that be an information board or something like that, or just a conversation with people as they walk through. I think a lot of the time it's not vindictive behaviour. It's a lot of the time it's absent-mindedness. So that's what we're doing on the countryside code, and trying to get ahead of the curve really between these 2 weeks of immense pressure. We are expecting quite a lot of pressure. The government's refreshed the countryside code, and that new one is going to be launched by the end of March, before everything sort of goes forwards, if that makes sense. And another thing is, I think I touched on it a little bit, it's very hard, but if somebody gets confronted, even if it's a reasonable request, they can often get defensive. So we've written to all the police and crime commissioners last week, and we wrote to all the national parks as well last week, to ask what support they're giving our members if things get difficult. And they're encouraging them to not get into a confrontational situation. Don't sort of become part of the problem. And if there's stuff that's going on, if you're looking up, not looking up, it's the wrong word. If you're inside a national park, then do make sure you know who your rangers are. Find the number. If you don't know who your rangers are, give us a shout, and we'll find that out for you. The Lake District National Park have got a really useful sort of alert system, which you can send an email to. I think they've got a phone number as well. So if you need to check out what that is, give us a shout. But failing that, make sure you know who your PCSOs are as well, your local police officers. So I'm going to shut up now, and I'll take any questions on hare coursing, rural crime, or the countryside code. Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, Libby. I'm actually going to go back to hares again just for a moment as the next bit. I sit nationally on the Shoot Liaison Committee along with a couple of colleagues in the CLA. So I joined Libby on a call with DEFRA a few weeks ago, because there is a move to introduce, or suggestion that they would like to introduce, a closed season for hares. And the DEFRA man on the call made the mistake of opening it by saying that the government see this as an easy win, and which provoked quite strong reaction, as you can imagine, from all of us on the call, pointing out that you shouldn't make wildlife legislation on the back of an easy win. You should make wildlife legislation because it is good for wildlife. And we went on to point out, Libby quite vigorously, that hare coursing was a much greater threat to hares than sporting hare shooting, very little of which happens. The majority of hares, if they're shot, are shot on a cull in an area where the numbers have gone through the roof and arable crops are under serious threat. And it's an attempt to reduce the numbers back to sustainable levels of hares. And that actually there's quite a lot of people who suffer from hare coursing, who, as a result, cull hares very heavily on their land just so that they don't get coursers coming there. And that if they get the coursing issue under control, farmers would generally be much happier to see a viable population of hares on their farm. So we did oppose it quite vigorously, along with all the other shoot organisations. I don't know whether our entreaties will fall on deaf ears or not. There are some people in government, I think, who are very keen on the idea, and we'll have to see where we get to on it. But that was really just a comment and an addendum to what Libby's just said about hare coursing. I'm going to go straight in now to what I call a potpourri, some of which some of you who've been on previous calls may have heard me talk about before. I'm going to go through it at a bit of a gallop, partly just to remind you, partly to give you an opportunity to ask more questions and ask more detail from me if you would like at the end. So the first one, which I lead on, and I wrote the guidance note on, is septic tanks. So please don't forget your septic tanks. The general binding rules came in over a year ago in January last year, and a septic tank may no longer discharge to any form of watercourse. Now, a watercourse is badly defined in the legislation, but any ditch that, even if it's dry for most of the summer, but might run a bit in the winter, is probably technically a watercourse. You don't have to panic. The Environment Agency have said that they quite openly admitted they don't have the manpower to enforce the legislation. They won't be going around inspecting everybody's septic tanks. But nonetheless, you should be aware, if you have a non-compliant septic tank on your land, there are two situations in which you should take immediate action. The first is if you are in danger of actually genuinely causing a pollution incident. If fish go belly up in your local stream and the Environment Agency investigate it and trace it back to your septic tank, the fines are potentially eye-watering. And the other one, on the practical note, is if you're contemplating a sale, because most of the talks I've given on septic tanks have been to rooms full of solicitors wanting to know what searching questions that they should be asking in the inquiries before contract. And if there is a non-compliant septic tank at the property, it's going to have two effects. It's going to firstly cause a delay on the sale. And secondly, it's likely to cause the buyer to ask for a whopping great reduction in the price in order to make the tank compliant, and probably very much greater than the real cost thereof. Other than that, if you've got a non-compliant septic tank, budget to make it compliant. I won't go into the details of how you do that now, but I'll happily talk to any members who want to know more about it, or send anyone the guidance note on the subject. Next one, I harp on a lot about, because it happens quite regularly, that members ring me, particularly when there's been a death in the family, an inheritance situation, and the son rings me and says, I've just inherited from dad, and dad let a couple of fields to a guy in the village, and he's done so for years and years and years and years and years, and there's never been a written agreement, or none that we can find. First question is does this guy have a protected tenancy? And secondly, what can I do about it? The answer is that if that tenancy existed before September 1995, even if it's unwritten, he has a protected tenancy almost certainly. If he's had continued occupation for agricultural purposes since before September 95, then the tenancy will be protected under the Agricultural Holdings Act 1986, and you can't get him off. His occupation is protected. The other worry with unwritten agreements under that act is that because there's no written agreement, there's no what's called a bar on assignment. And a bar on assignment is something that prohibits the occupier from assigning his right, his tenancy, whatever it may be, to a third party, i.e. to pass it on to his uncle, his brother, or more worryingly, a limited company. So Fred Smith Tenant becomes Fred Smith Tenant Limited, and he assigns his tenancy to a limited company. A limited company never dies, the tenancy never dies, and you as owner have lost control of that land forever. So if don't, for a kickoff, enter into unwritten agreements ever. If you have one of these old tenancies which is subject to that act, then please think about serving what's called a Section 6 notice immediately. If you're in that situation, give me a ring and I'll explain it in more detail. But the crucial part of a Section 6 notice, which is a demand for a written tenancy agreement, is that it also is an instantaneous bar on assignment. So just flagging that one up, I've done it several times before. The other problem with unwritten agreements is that there's no early resumption clause. So if you get planning consent to put some houses on that land, you're going to have to do a deal with the tenant to get him off. You can't just serve a notice to quit, because it won't work. Again, I can talk more about that if needed. Next, gallop through compulsory purchase. Regular occurrence, all sorts of bodies have access to compulsory powers, from phone mast companies now, unfortunately, to Highways England, your local authority, and etc., all the water companies and so on. If you've got compulsory purchase in any form coming down the tracks at you, please get planning early. So get in place your lawyers and your agents. But talk to them about it. Make sure you got the right team acting for you. Again, talk to me if you want help on it. But get them in place. But tell them not to do any significant work other than some homework until you've actually formally been served notice of entry, because that is the legal point at which the acquiring authority, which is the name for given to whoever's exercising the compulsory powers, the acquiring authority has to pay their costs, not you. So work done before then, you in theory would have to pay those costs. Do a really detailed photographic record of any land that's going to be involved. Every gateway, the state of the crop, the soil, the grassland, whatever it might be, really careful photographic record. And keep a contemporaneous diary. Keep a diary by the phone, and anytime you do anything relating to that compulsory power, make a note of it. It's a wonderful tool for your agent to go back and claim for your time, which is a claimable item in dealing with the compulsory purchase. And if they can sit there and say, on 29th of March, my client spent 2 hours on the phone trying to get your contractors to come back and sort out such and such. 30th of March, he was out at 6 in the morning gathering sheep because one of your contractors left a gate open. Whatever it might be, these are all claimable items, so keep a diary. Exclude drainage matters from the final settlement. So make sure your agent, you probably will anyway, make sure your agent in reaching final settlement with the acquiring authority excludes drainage. It's all too often they cut through some old Victorian tile drain that you don't even know was there, but has worked perfectly well for hundreds of years. And a drainage problem appears in a field a year later and long after they've gone. So exclude drainage. Fees. Fees are frequently becoming a major issue. A lot of the companies, particularly water companies, and United Utilities are big sinners in this respect, are trying to insist that they pay fees to land agents on what's called ride scale. Ride scale was the old scale, which was in place when I was originally in practice back in, I think it was originally formulated in 1991 or 2. It was chucked out by the office of the Deputy Prime Minister when John Prescott was Deputy Prime Minister. And there was a case, Poole v South West Water, I think 2011, where it all went to court, where South West Water were trying to insist they would only pay fees on ride scale. The court threw it out. It has no validity. People are still trying to use it now. Fees should be properly paid on the time spent by your professional advisors and not anything else. I think that's most of what I've got on that. Last one. If at all possible, make sure that your agent agrees really quite detailed heads of terms before they start the work. Because once they're on your land and they've got the majority of what they want, they will dig their heels in and be horrifyingly slow. So if you can get them to agree it before they start, at least quite detailed heads of terms on how the thing is going to work, then so much the better. And the last one from my potpourri are mast sites. I'm still getting calls about mast site renewals. The Digital Economy Act that came in December 2017 contained a really unfortunate and actually sort of retrograde clause where it has a valuation clause which excludes the use of the site as a mast site from the valuation. In other words, a mast site now is valued on its existing use, agricultural or woodland or whatever it might be. And the mast site companies are trying to pay tuppence halfpenny in rent. This has resulted, of course, in people not bothering, understandably, not bothering to bring any sites forward for masts because it's not worth their while, and incredibly low offers for renewal from the mast site companies where there are existing masts. There is currently a consultation going on this, which ends on the 24th of March. If you have any interest in mast sites, I would urge you to go online and respond to the consultation. The minister has said he's not talking about the valuation clause, but there are ways of you putting it into your response to the consultation anyway, and it would be great if you would do that. We go on battling. I think that the rents that used typically to be 5,000 or 6,000 will be settling back to levels 1,500 to 2,500, which at least is a bit of an improvement on the £100 that one of our members was offered for the entirety of a 25-year lease when the Act first became law. I shall stop talking there. I'll hand back to Libby initially in case she's got any potpourri other items that have occurred to her, and then I'll throw the floor open for questions.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, I think we should head towards questions now. You can either stick your hand up on your hand button or write stuff into the chat, and we'll pick that up there. Just on the side, we do cover lots of other issues. So if it's something that's land-based and it's bothering you, or you're not sure, or you just want to ask a question, just pick the phone up. There's always somebody here. Just a quick reminder that Countryside Stewardship is currently open for applications. So if anybody's thinking about doing something on their land, then do take a look at that. Again, pick the phone up, we can point you in the right direction. I also lead on grants and broadband. So yeah, any further questions about that, you can either ask questions now or just you've got our email address, so you can get in touch with us at any time. So does anybody want to raise any questions? I'll hand back to Robert to complete that.
Yeah, I'm here, guys. Ask away. Don't worry. If you've got no questions, that's fine. But any rural-based issue, it doesn't have to be something I've talked about now. Or if it's private, as Libby has said, if it's a private issue, you want to talk privately, then give me a call. Ping me an email.
Robert Campbell has got his hand up. So Robert,
ooh, jolly good.
Can you hear us, Robert?
Unmute yourself, Robert, and fire away.
Hang on a minute. Is that better?
Yep.
Yeah.
Robert, I'm concerned about land drainage, basically because the local authorities are not taking consideration of the overloading of land drains through my property when they put great big building sites on. We've got one, the latest one in Stokesley. Yes, they put a huge tank in to take the flood water, but of course that ends up going in the river, so it prolongs the time that the river's too high. The one before that, they cleaned out the river. They took about over a metre of sludge and stuff out of the bottom, but that was about 15 or 20 years ago, and they've done nothing since. So there's a metre of sludge in the bottom now. And we don't seem to have any clawback through the planning process or any other process to do anything about it.
Yeah, monster frustrations. It's supposed to nowadays be designed through SUD, through sustainable urban drainage schemes, and they are supposed to work it out. It's still an ongoing frustration. I remember up near on the outskirts of Newcastle with quite a lot of development up there, who's had row after row with the developer over drainage and how it's handled. I suppose it's another argument to say that drainage boards are a good way forward, because they will go on handling the digging out of streams and ditches where the Environment Agency say, oh, we're not doing that, it's not main river. And furthermore, we've been told to concentrate on flooding, that prevention of flooding of houses and the built environment, and forget about agricultural land, which they have. It's not a satisfactory situation. I'll have a think and get back to you, Robert, if I got any obvious additional comments or suggestions to make. But getting the local authority to come back and dig that ditch out again now, I suspect is going to be somewhere between tricky and utterly impossible, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I've got one at the moment where they look as if they're going to pass an application where the water is going to be absorbed by the soil, but it's on the top of a brickwork where there used to be a brickworks. So I
mean, on that sort of situation, I think you should write a careful letter of objection explaining the problem, because when you object to a planning application, the objection has got to be material. Quite often people write in and object to a planning application because it's going to spoil their view. But spoiling of, nobody legally has a right to a view, and spoiling a view is not therefore what would be deemed a material matter, and therefore the project officer, planning officer dealing with the application would simply ignore it. Whereas drainage certainly is a material reason to look at it, and what you've got actually is a very material objection of explaining that underneath that is not soil that can absorb water, but an old brickworks, and which isn't going to let the water go anywhere. So I should point that out. And possibly try and time your letter so that it goes in just before the whole thing goes to committee, so it's one of the first objections the committee see.
Right, thanks. Thank you.
Anyone else got a hand up?
I've got a question for you, Robert.
Oh God, okay.
When can my parents let their chickens out?
Oh, okay, so this relates to avian flu. Those of you that have hens should know, I hope you do know, that there is currently a housing order nationwide because of avian flu. The last outbreak well in the country was actually not, it was in our patch, it was in Cleveland to Redcar in February. The restriction zone around it has just been lifted, so it's now just part of the general restriction. I keep hens, so I'm very aware of it. Luckily, we've got some old kennels, which is where our hens are. I'm hoping that the restriction order will be lifted in the next month. I'd be very surprised if it isn't. But at the moment, it's still in place. I checked the other day. Any more for any more?
Can't see any hands up at the moment. Can I just go over the future events?
Yeah, you absolutely run through what
Yeah.
joyous things are coming up for our members. Off you go.
I'm going to pop this in the chat as well. So we've got a national tourism seminar, which is going to take place on the 30th of March at noon. We've got our rural crime seminar, which I've mentioned before, which is the 22nd of April at 11 AM. And we've got an access seminar, which will be the 28th of April in the afternoon. We haven't got a time for that yet, but I'll pop them in the chat as well, so you can screenshot it or whatever you do.
Great, thanks, Libby. While she's doing that, any last questions? Anything bothering anybody on rural issues? Other than that, keep an eye for all of these events on our e-news that Henk puts out. I know Henk's on this call. He's very thorough, and it's so keep an eye on those. It's a good way to keep in contact with, keep up to speed with what we've got going on. And now, when you see an article in the CLA magazine, if it raises, quite often I think they raise more questions than they answer. So do please pick the phone up to one of us and say, Robert, I've just seen the article about X or Y. Tell me more. If I don't know the answer, I'll find it out. Other than that, thank you all for logging in this afternoon. I hope that's been a useful gallop through. We're going to end at about 45 minutes, which I think is probably about right for this sort of event before we start boring the pants off you. So unless there's any final questions and frantic hand waving, Libby, have you got everything on the screen that everybody wants? Yeah,
I've written that all in the chat. So if you want to just give you a few minutes to have a quick look in the chat about when those future events are coming through, and hopefully we'll see you there.
Okay, well, thanks again, everybody, and have a good rest of the day and rest of the week for that matter. Those who do need to get hold of me, because of COVID, I've ended up with an awful lot of untaken leave. So I did a deal with Dorothy, and I'm on a 3-day week until Easter. So I'm only available Tuesdays through to Thursdays. I'm taking Fridays and Mondays off until Easter. So so thank you all very much, and best wishes. And if I don't see you before, happy Easter. Bye.